New York legislation to administer the new parole law, asserted that state use was designed to stimulate the motivation and psyche and not just the brute labor power of the convicts. So this is an era of great interest in the sociology of the prison. Two of the leading reform-oriented sociologists at the University of Chicago, Robert Park and Ernest Burgess, who basically set up shop inside the Stateville Penitentiary, and their graduate students are there running basically the parole system. As John Irwin, himself a convict in the correctional institution era of the 1950s, says of the Big House era and its problems, the administration of those prisons had the primary and difficult problem of maintaining control over a potentially obstreperous and rebellious prisoner population that greatly outnumbered the staff and with insufficient raw force. The prisoners had to withstand the pains of imprisonment, indignity, deprivation, and had to live side by side with other deviants, many of whom were repulsive or dangerous to them. So it's sort of describing the tensions of the Big House, tensions partly mediated by parole. These tensions factor very much in the background of prison movies. It's one of the reasons I think that the prison becomes such a fascinating subject of American popular culture, beginning in the 1920s. Over the next 30 years, there's a whole set of classic movies, among the most favorite being the These Four. Many of you may have seen The Birdman of Alcatraz, which obviously, as its name suggests, is set at Alcatraz. Here's another one with Bogart at San Quentin. In fact, Bogart shows up at San Quentin in several movies of this era. So it's an interesting window into both the nature of these Big House prisons, but also their place in our cultural and social order at that time. And it's interesting to ask, how did these Big House prisons come about? Why did we build them? We saw that at the birth of the penitentiary, there was a whole set of concerns about the nature of punishment around scaffold punishment, driven by the tremendous economic and political changes associated with the end of the 18th century. By the time we get to the end of the 19th century, there's not the kind of excitement and enthusiasm about new penal ideas so much that seem to explain a wave of building. So what does explain it? And I think prison punishment and society scholars, drawing on the toolkits that we discussed, have pointed to a number of different dimensions that probably drove this wave of prison construction and that has left our penal landscape with so many of these Big House prisons. Certainly beginning in the late 19th century, it's a time of tremendous industrial growth in America. There are terrible economic downturns like the 1870 recession, which is as deep a depression really as anything up to that time, and very much like our own time in many ways. But it's also a time of tremendous inequality and wealth, the Gilded Age. And actually I have slides for some of these. I'll just take you through them briefly. Right, so you're getting this is J.P. Morgan, whose name remains on Wall Street, but who was probably the leading example of a sort of financier, probably not a billionaire, but multimillionaire of his time, associated with the rise of great industrial companies of that period, like RCA, General Electric. So there's a lot of, between this tremendous economic growth as well as inequality, many sociologists have argued from a Marxist as well as a Durkheimian perspective that there was a tremendous amount of insecurity in this period in American history and a desire for the criminal law, as Durkheim would suggest, as a form of sort of norm reinforcement. The strife, certainly with the rising labor movement, provides both an economic reason for perhaps a crackdown, a law and order crackdown, and putting a lot of people in prison. That is, first of all, labor activity is often considered criminal activity in this era, so some of the people you're sweeping into prison are labor activists. Also because prison workers might be strike breakers, especially released prisoners who are on parole and have to take any job available. So there's some utility in having a larger prison population during a period of growing labor strife. There's also new ideas about how to accomplish social order, and again, associated with the economy. Ford, obviously Henry Ford of automobile fame, puts his stamp on really a whole idea about how you can essentially control large populations or govern large complicated operations like an automobile industry on a kind of gigantic basis. Ford built a renowned and much copied factory in this period at River Rouge near Detroit, which remains, I think, one of the largest industrial sites ever built. And Ford's idea was basically every part of the car ought to be built by Ford. So you'd have a rubber factory, a steel factory, everything you needed to build cars would be part of one gigantic factory complex. And it may be that this idea inspired the government to think that prisons also ought to kind of move up on a giant level and try to accomplish maybe the things that they could accomplish in smaller bites, they could accomplish in a sort of gigantic way. There's no doubt that immigration, which was reaching its peak in those years, may have created both social anxiety in a Durkheimian sense, supporting political pressure for crackdowns and more prison, but also, of course, the possibility of prison as effectively a form of internal exile for those who could not be deported if there was an economic downturn, as there would be in the 1930s. Of course, prohibition, which itself, the rendering of alcoholic beverages illegal, which began in 1919, became law in 1920 and 1921, and obviously resulted in an immediate and enormous expansion of criminal activity simply by transforming lots of legal activity into criminal activity. There's no doubt that Prohibition-era arrests created a sense of lawlessness, as well as the reality of lots of arrested bodies. In Detroit, Prohibition, I think, began sort of January 1st, 1920 or 1921, to double check if you've got Google there. By 1925, 27,000 people had been arrested just in Detroit alone, right? So the fact that they built a prison near Detroit to hold over 5,000 people, not so surprising given that. Now, the sort of strong social interest in a new wave of prison designs and prison buildings did go along with the revival of some new penological ideas. Zebulon Brockway, who was a New York-based warden of essentially a juvenile reformatory called Elmira, there's a picture of his reformatory, became sort of a leading figure for a nationwide renaissance of new ideas and confidence that penal reform could be achieved. As I said, in the 1860s and 70s, there had been kind of a lull, so this was kind of a resurgence in the 1880s and 1890s. And this kind of fits together nicely with the loss of the labor system, the contract system, the need for a new control regime inside prisons. And parole, as you can imagine, is sort of the perfect meeting point for those two different trajectories, with sort of labor control going down inside the prison and a desire for a new model based on scientific rehabilitation from the new penology. Parole, the idea that you can release prisoners early no matter what their what their sentence is, if they've behaved well and if you think that they're reformed, marries those two things rather nicely if you think about it. On one hand, it gives a direct legal manifestation to the idea that you really are in the business of rehabilitating people, at least you say you are, and at the same time it gives you a nice soft tool of control, as McLennan suggested, that gives inmates a very good reason. California actually adopted a form of the indeterminate sentence in 1899, very much in line with New York, which does it around the same time. It's not as extreme as the model that we'll adopt in 1944, but it does mean that most sentences after 1899 are modifiable by parole. Another sort of way of thinking about the value of the big house prisons is, as I already mentioned, we can think of it as a form of punishment that lends itself to the needs of building a more effective and reliable political system as well. As I said, this was a heyday of lots of corruption in prisons. That corruption sounds bad, but it also had a political function. That is, it could become a major source of resource or wealth, if you will, jobs, commodities, to be distributed through the patronage system. Right? This is an era that pretty much dominates American politics until after World War II, of what historians and political scientists call the patronage system. By and large, one way to think about it is that politicians, even politicians that became president, like a Calvin Coolidge or eventually a Franklin Roosevelt, weren't so much national kind of pop star figures like our politicians are so much. They were local patronage chiefs, basically. You'd be the mayor of Cleveland or the mayor of Chicago, and you would use the enormous amount of control over jobs that that position gave you to build up a chain of political loyalty that would get you to the governor's office in Illinois or New Jersey or New York, and from there you'd make deals with similar chiefs around the country to decide who would be the next candidate of your party for president at what would inevitably be a brokered convention. Now we just talk about a brokered convention as an unusual, almost unimaginable outcome. That was the way presidential candidates were selected in that era. So the prison had a number of political functions. It could be a wonderful source of patronage. Think about all the jobs at a place like Jackson Prison, housing over 5,000 inmates. You'd have hundreds and hundreds of prison officers, but also construction workers, etc. But also it projected an image of state power at a time when certainly the state role in the economy was rather minor, and we did not yet have the extensive regulatory system that would come later. In retrospect, it's kind of curious that the big house prisons, as I said, were ever built because they seem way too big to be easily governable. They didn't really have the work, the labor opportunities that they would have needed to achieve the kind of industrial model that they seem to be built on. One reason is that prisons are and other innovations in the penal realm are not necessarily chosen because they work, but because among the available ideas around, they look like they have a better chance of working at a time when people feel there's a real need for answers. And that's certainly true of this period, whereas we've seen there was a lot of anxiety about crime and diversity and change in American society. Building big prisons certainly was one way to show that the state was taking those threats very seriously. Obviously, it would take decades for anyone to decide if they worked or not, so from a political point of view, it didn't really matter whether they worked. They looked like we were doing something. They fit very well with America's predominant ideology then as now, which is basically get a job, that work is the answer to most social problems, and therefore get people to work. This looked like a good way of making people work, and even if it wasn't performing them, at least it was making them do something that other Americans could shake their head and say, yeah, that's what people should be doing. They shouldn't be sitting on their duffs. They should be working. So it had a tremendous amount of coherence with the larger cultural values. Why did it fail? Eventually, this shrinkage in the labor that they could bring to bear inside the prison created a situation where the inmate culture, essentially outgrew the ability of the internal control system to discipline it. With the decline of work, increasingly volatile racial structure as the number of minorities in prison went up, especially after World War II, and especially after World War II, minorities were less willing to accept being stuck at the bottom of the social order, even in prison. Just as they were in society, they were saying, well, why just the worst jobs? Why aren't we part of the larger order? So a great deal of tension inside prisons. In the first years of the 1950s, dozens of riots break out, and there have been earlier waves of riots. And basically, if you're a politician, prison riots are up there historically with, having prostitutes visit your hotel room the night before your convention speech or whatever, in terms of a sudden death possibility for politicians, because by and large, prisons are the biggest state institution, especially in this era, and the governor is obviously associated with that state institution. And when you have a riot, when you have the people who are supposed to be being disciplined and controlled because they're a threat to the public, taking over the prison, endangering guards, etc., that generally is a very bad event from a governor's point of view. There's almost no good side to that. It's good if you're the next governor, right? You can kind of say, like, I came in, I straightened things out, we haven't had a riot since, knock on wood. It's bad for the current governor. So I think the big house began to produce too many of these. It had sort of a last hurrah during World War II, because suddenly that labor problem went away. I mean, there's nothing like sending 20 million American men overseas to generate a strong demand for labor at home, right here in the Bay Area. So San Quentin, here you see an image of inmates at San Quentin in 1942, and it's actually kind of a perfect image for this moment, who are unloading a large load of copper cable salvaged from Pearl Harbor after the destruction of the fleet there in late 1941. So, you see inmates literally becoming part of the war effort, obviously at the bottom of the industrial pile. But one might have expected the war to revitalize the big house, but it really didn't. For one thing, it didn't last. And after the war, actually, there was a great deal of fear that there would be a Great Depression that would follow World War II. Nobody expected the economy to surge the way it did. There were also ideological changes. The Holocaust and the growing awareness of the role of concentration camps, which were often described as labor camps as well, and the Soviet version of them, which were even more likely to be characterized as labor camps, made the whole idea of industrial prisons a little bit more repugnant to a lot of people. It seemed a little, especially at a time when we were talking about reform and growing respect for human dignity, the idea that prisons ought to be giant factories had this uncomfortable association with concentration camps. It also reflected, I think, the shift that begins with Roosevelt, certainly, and his New Deal, toward an image of the government, and this is again a kind of Foucauldian point, its style of governance, as based on a kind of scientific form of expertise. This is a very famous cartoon from the early stages of the Great Depression. It shows Roosevelt as a doctor making a house call on the very sick American public, who looks like a addled guy from Kentucky or something. But you see Congress, sort of a worried mother or wife, and FDR is saying, of course, we may have to change remedies if we don't get results. And that was very much the image that FDR tried to create in the early stages of the New Deal. He talked about himself as Dr. New Deal, and that he would keep trying whatever it took to bring the economy to heal. Now, that image of government as a kind of medical healer who experiments, makes empirical judgments about what works, tries again, is a different kind of image of government control than is projected by the big house prisons and their kind of industrial workforce model. It's an example. In some ways, we continue to have this debate today in our political system, whether government is just like a business or is like something else, right? So the prison as big house is very compatible with the idea that the government is just a big business, basically, and we've got a factory here as a prison. The New Deal is very much associated with the idea of government as something else, maybe more like a profession, like medicine or the clergy or law, that isn't just a business, that has more expertise, involves more professional judgment, etc. Not so compatible with the big house. But what comes next, and this is really the next layer in our penal landscape, if you were thinking about California prisons, we built our first prison in 1851 at San Quentin. We built several big house prisons at San Quentin and later at Folsom, a women's big house prison at Tehachapi in the mountains northeast of LA in the 1920s, and that accumulates about 4 prisons. And then after World War II, we built about 9 new prisons, and these conform to what is beginning to call itself a correctional institution model. These prisons are named correctional institutions rather than prisons. Here's CIW, which is the California Institution for Women. Here's Soledad, which was a youth prison built to be an industrial training facility, but for younger offenders with good prospects of entering the workforce. A couple things to notice just about the physical layout of these prisons. Notice that they don't emphasize isolation, even though they are to some extent isolated from the big cities where most of the prisoners are coming from, and they're located in rural areas, as our prisons are today. They're not radically separated out. Today there are walls around these prisons, but they weren't designed originally to have much of a wall, probably just a fence around them. You weren't going to need to prevent people from escaping because you have parole and rehabilitative programming to help people get out so that people wouldn't want to leave to some extent, but also because you imagine that you would be running a regime of personal communication and control, so you wouldn't need to kind of the brute force or the panoptic approach to control. California Correctional Center in 1963, California Men's Colony 1954. Here's a bigger shot of CIW. So just a brief overview of this correctional institution model, which basically, again, we're taking California as an example. At the end of the 1970s, more than half of our prisons are these new correctional institution prisons. Lots of people are still being held in the old big house prisons, which are being treated as sort of for the worst case scenario. The people who aren't getting rehabilitated, the tougher cases, will be at Folsom and San Quentin. So it's somebody like George Jackson, who I asked you to read about. So he's originally at Soledad because he's considered a young, youthful offender who could be rehabilitated. Once he becomes the sort of public enemy number one of the correctional officers and the prison administrators, he's moved to San Quentin, which is seen as much more of a secure prison for irascible and resistant prisoners. So the correctional institution, of course, as its name suggests, emphasizes treatment. And we'll take a look at some of its treatment approaches. Parole, the practice of releasing prisoners who have shown signs of rehabilitation early, has reached a kind of peak in this era. In 1944, California enacts a new indeterminate sentencing law, or ISL as it's called, in which most, if not all, felonies come with a life sentence, but with an expectation that you'll be paroled potentially after a very short amount of time. So George Jackson, who becomes a famous prison leader and revolutionary hero to some, is originally sent to prison for an armed robbery that he's essentially the minor, at least not the leading participant in, and he gets a sentence of 1 year to life. And he's actually told by his lawyer that he'll probably get out in 6 months, based on the then practice. In this model of individualized treatment and diagnosis, prisons have to be kind of like hospitals, or they imagine that they are, and so prisons had what were called adjustment centers. These were usually places where a prisoner who's either coming in for the first time or undergoing some kind of crisis would be brought to be intensively observed and diagnosed, as it were. Some of the features of this kind of institution as a structure of organization, it's very bureaucratic. Prisons in the big house era had tended to be run by individual wardens who were basically God for that prison and answered only to the governor. One of the things that happens after World War II is, and California's a leader here, is the creation of departments of corrections, which are full-scale bureaucracies. There's a strong association with social science. I've already mentioned the indeterminate sentence. The classification technique that begins in New York in the 1890s reaches kind of a peak here. When you're in the adjustment center, before they decide which prison to send you, they're going to give you all kinds of tests, psychiatric tests, educational tests to try to classify you. There's a big emphasis on architecture in designing prisons that are more conducive to learning, to education, and to informality, right? Those images of CIW, you can imagine inmates walking in the green areas together. It's not the kind of lockstep model of the big house. One of the most interesting techniques, turns out one of the few techniques really of rehabilitation that California utilized in the post-World War II period was known as bibliotherapy. And this is actually a photo of an art installation done fairly recently, but inspired by the history of bibliotherapy, and especially the role of San Quentin's librarian between 1947 and 1968, a man named Herman Spector, who we'll describe in a bit of detail in the chapter I asked you to read from Eric Cummins' book. But the basic idea of bibliotherapy was to use reading and an intensive, essentially private experience of thinking about and reading novels, but also nonfiction books, to coordinate with and presumably help drive a process of individual rehabilitation that would ultimately also involve psychotherapy. But because prisons were large and therapy a process that requires some intimacy, Spector and other prison librarians believe that books could play a really major role. And the numbers of these are rather remarkable. San Quentin in this era had a library of over 33,000 titles, almost none of which were law books. They actually didn't want the prisoners to have much access to law books, but they were novels, histories, philosophy. And unlike most Americans even then, notwithstanding not having the internet, still didn't really like to read very much, prisoners at San Quentin did read, either because they were bored or because they understood that in the new game of parole, it was important to show that you were doing what you could to rehabilitate and better yourself. Interestingly, this also became a time of intense writing by inmates. As Cummins is able to discover from the records of San Quentin's library, in the 1950s and 60s, something like 2,000 manuscripts a year are being produced by San Quentin prisoners. And they have to submit them to the librarian because